right, everybody, welcome to the Middle Ground Mike. Want to welcome back Dan. How are you doing today?
Doing okay, Joe. It's nice to be back here again.
Yeah, I had a lot of people listen to a lot of clips and stuff from our last one, and they got a lot of positive feedback from it.
Oh, good,
Like a
good. I'm
lot of
glad to
people,
hear that.
yeah, they were like, you know what? Even my friends that are conservative were like, I actually really enjoyed that. And I
Good.
was like, that's my whole purpose behind it. You don't have to be identical thinkers to have a conversation.
Yeah. Well, let's do it again because I think what you'll find out is that we'll have a lot more agreements than disagreements on a lot of these issues. So,
Yeah,
uh,
yeah. One thing we didn't touch on per se earlier that I think is like a big thing is the political violence we have in Minnesota.
oh yeah,
Even Donald Trump came out and condemned that. He didn't tiptoe around it. He just was like, no. Which was it was nice to see because sometimes he can be petty, if you want to call it that, and with the attempt on his life, you know, it just seems like that would be something where he'd be like, well, somebody calls us by da da da. It's what it tends to say. So I was very, I'll say pleased, but it was nice to see, okay, hey, this was truly about what happened to these people and not about the.
well, yeah. I'm gonna draw a line here though because I think to a large degree many of the Republicans are clutching their pearls over this thing,
Yeah.
and certainly they're not. I don't think they're being genuine either because the rhetoric coming out of this president has been violent. Let's face it, it's been violent. And the rhetoric coming out of the Speaker of the House, uh, Mike Johnson, talking about tarring and feathering Gavin Newsom,
Yeah.
it's you've got the Marjorie Taylor Greene, who along with who's a guy that was just thrown out of Congress recently for embezzlement, but they were embracing and still remain very close to some of these extremist organizations like the Proud Boys and the Truthers and the Oath Keepers and so on. Um, No, and if you look at some of the political ads, I don't know what it's like about Michigan, but it's probably pretty similar to Missouri here. Our political ads here featured violence. You have political campaigners shooting guns, as part of their campaign video, shooting guns, using flamethrower, using baseball bats. This is the kind of thing that goes on, and when it continues like
Not too
this.
much up here.
Okay, yeah, it's that way in Missouri here. I raised objections about it, but of course I'm just one voice. But we see, was it Melissa Hortman was her name, and her husband Mark? They were gunned down. This I'm just afraid this is going to start happening a lot more because there's a whole lot of rhetoric out there that has been violent for a very long time, and you have also uh, this white replacement theory, this replacement theory that a lot of people come up with, that Tucker Carlson has been pushing very heavily. Um, it basically they're saying, okay, you all are under a threat. You're going to be replaced, and here are the guns. Here's the violence. You just add two and two together, you're going to end up with this. Now, of course, when it actually happens, the president's going to come out and say, "Oh no, we can't have this. We can't have this." But I don't take that. I don't take him at his word on this one. I think the violent rhetoric is going to continue from this man.
I guess for me, it was just the initial, because when the late John not come out and, offer condolences.
Right.
So I was like, okay, at least that's some kind of change in a basic tone, and I'm sure you heard about Bill Maher, had dinner with him. And Bill Maher said, the guy that I had dinner with is not the same guy you see on TV.
Yeah. Yeah.
He said, he actually cares. He wants to know about what I think. Pretty much was even saying he wasn't derogatory. He said pretty much he was just your normal everyday guy. And he even said, he goes, I feel more comfortable telling him what I think than I would of Barack Obama or George Bush.
Yeah.
He was like, he said he just made it, and he still is not like endorsing him or anything of that nature, But he said, he goes, I can see why now, because of some of the things that he may have. But I just thought the initial reaction was a lot better than it has been in the past for him on a lot of things, and I felt like Bill Maher exemplified that.
Yeah.
You know, and that was like, I don't think during Trump's first term he would have had dinner with somebody like Bill Maher.
Well, there's a difference between the persona that people project and what they are in personal life. Yeah, I've never gotten to know Trump on a personal basis. Would I take that opportunity? Yeah, probably to see what it's like, see if I have that same Bill Maher experience. But that's really, it's all kind of moot, and it doesn't really apply, because what really matters is what he says and the policies that he's trying to promote, and what he says to the public, especially like I talked about with amplifying the violent rhetoric. That's unacceptable. And
No,
I don't care how good of a guy is in person. If we could sit down and have a beer together, fine. But there's a difference. There's a difference between being personally amicable and actually going out in public and being just
yeah,
vile.
that is. I had seen a video about a lot of things Trump had done, for people, right? They had never like went out and like made a big deal about, or hey, look at me, look what I did for people. And then I'm like, why don't you present this side of you to the public? Because I think it would be ironic. Because if you did, I feel like the guy would be insanely more popular.
I would argue with that too, because I think that he knows look, this guy's smart. Don't don't
Yeah, yeah,
don't,
he's
don't
not dumb.
underestimate him. He's not very smart in in areas. I think he's just not very curious about certain things. But when it comes to publicity and
Yeah,
gaining
he knows this.
marketing control, the guy's a genius, and that's what he does. And so he's speaking to the Republican Party exactly what a lot of people in the Republican Party want to hear. He listened to what happened when in 2008, or I should say 2009, right after Barack Obama took the presidency. Within a month, who was at the Tea Party took off, and they started this rhetoric, this I said the replacement theory rhetoric, and I think when it came to what was at the election in 2016 when Jeb Bush was running, he was running a classic campaign. He was running a classic Republican campaign where he took note of all the mistakes the Republicans made up to that point in terms of not connecting with the people. And if you recall, some of the campaign messages had to deal with making amends with minorities and advocating for a path to citizenship, just like his brother George W. Bush did. And that was his way, and that was really, I think, it was a smart thing to do, because that was the Republican Party basically coming up to speed with where people were. But by that time, though, that the Tea Party, which had now merged with the Republican Party, would have none of that. During the time that Jeb Bush is doing this, Republicans all across the states, the state governors, were all switching over to a more radical, extremist side of republicanism based on, let's face it, it's all based on white supremacy. And it took hold. And Trump saw what Jeb was doing, and I think he made a prudent decision. And I'm not saying it was the right decision, but he made a prudent decision and said, that's not where the Republicans want to go. They want to go in this other direction here. They want to feel threatened. They want to be able to kick out the immigrants and so on. I mean, all the vile things that he says and does now. He's saying what the people want to hear. So, yeah, on a personal level, maybe he's a great guy. I don't know. But on the public level, boy, oh boy, he knows what he's doing, and he knows how to stir up the crowd, and he knows how to get
Oh yeah, he
things
does.
done. So that's where I have to draw the line. Like, yeah, on a personal level, maybe he's good. I don't know. When he talked
Yeah,
about the Central Park Five, I have my doubts though. But
yeah. It was just some of the things that Bill Maher had said. But like I think Bill Maher said he had took a sheet of paper with all the insults Trump ever tweeted or whatever about him, and he said Trump laughed and smiled and signed it and gave it back to him.
yeah, well, he wants
And
to
I
feel that
was
he's
like,
human, right? Maybe he is
yeah,
human after all. Who knows, right?
you know, I just thought I was like, oh man, I was like, okay, I was like, I can live with that one. But yeah, switching gears a little bit. I don't know if you've heard some of the other stuff I posted, but I've been a very big critic of the strike on Iran. I've been a huge critic of, it's Israel's business, really, not mine, right? But some people, I guess, if you want to call it, Trump's kind of come out and pretty much told Benjamin Netanyahu he's full of it recently. But it kind of felt like it was like kind of like what Saudi Arabia had alluded to the media is that we were becoming Benjamin Netanyahu's puppet.
Yeah,
In a way, we were doing his bidding. And I get where like I don't blame Israel for what they did in the aftermath of that attack when it first happened I think it was October 7th, 2024, around 2023, right? Uh, and I get that, right? Justified, maybe to the level where it's at now, though? No. Now I think it's just, trying to take a nuclear bomb doing that. And it's going, okay, the world didn't really step in and say too much when it first happened because you were justified in feeling and doing what you did to a degree. But after what you're fighting people who can't fight you. I mean, I don't know if genocide's the right word. It can definitely be attributed that way depending how you listen to the rhetoric. But Netanyahu's a dangerous man. And I'm not saying that because he's Jewish. I'm not being anti Semitic. Him as a politician is a dangerous. There's a lot of protests about the things he's doing inside of Israel. They don't put that part on the media. You know what I mean? Because that just wouldn't serve. Let's be honest, it wouldn't serve a lot of our politicians, Democrat and Republican, who I don't want to say like serve Israel's interests, but they tend to be friends of Israel.
Well, yeah, don't underestimate the power of APAC, American Israeli Political Action Committee. I think that's what that stands for. They come in with a lot of money and they have a lot of influence over the politicians here. And money speaks in this country. Unfortunately, money speaks. What I take objection to is, and I agree with you about this genocide thing. And I noticed that you talked about the fact that it's gone too far. We teeter on the edge of being labeled as anti-Semitic just by saying that.
Yes.
It was like when Barack Obama was president and people would criticize him to say, oh, you're just anti-Black. Well, it has nothing to do with it, right? I mean, the guy, I personally, have a lot of criticisms of Obama, a lot, but none of it has to do with his skin color. It's just a lot of it has to do with his incompetence. But, you can't be critical of Israel these days without being painted as anti-Semitic.
Yes.
And what's really weird about this whole thing, as you cited, is there's a whole lot of Jewish people that are on our side. They look at this whole thing as genocide as well. So to me,
Yeah.
that's proof that this is not an anti-Semitic thing.
It's like depending how you want to look at the rhetoric, it's borderline right there. I mean, the definition, it just depends who you listen to.
Yeah.
But to be fair, when a lot of like AOCs of the world, they came out and they're like, "Oh, president doesn't have authority. We need to impeach him." All right, let's put the brakes on. What he did, presidents in this country have been doing for a long time now. And it is. Do I know if it's law or not? No, but I know a lot of things in that aspect have been brought up before the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court has said, and I believe what the president can, it's either 30 or 60 days they can issue certain military actions and limited strikes.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, let's focus on the things that he does do wrong.
Yeah.
And not sit there, because let's say 20 years from now, there's some nut job somewhere. And I'm sorry, but our congressional leaders don't act with any sense of urgency.
Right.
They sure aren't going to get out of bed in the middle of the night to stop something. So I think that the president does need a limited ability to do things like that. I just don't think Iran was the right choice.
Yeah, I'm ambivalent about that. I mean, I go back and forth on it because in the wrong hands, it can be extremely dangerous. And I think we're seeing that case right now where we might have just kicked the hornet's nest here. And who knows what's going to happen. I'm looking at this in the long term, 20, 30 years from now, our children and our grandchildren are going to be looking at this thing saying, why did you guys do this? Because now we've got terrorism. Why do Iranians hate us? Well, we've given them quite a few reasons to hate us.
Well, every president we've had, as far as I can think of, has done some sort of reaction against the Iranians. Nobody in the United States has really tried to truly build a bridge with Iran.
Yeah, that's true.
Political speak, they do. They'll kind of just be, oh, well, yeah, And I was, I'm sitting there thinking, well, if Trump can make nice with Kim Jong-un, maybe he can get the Ayatollah to come to the table, and at least,
Yeah.
That didn't happen. But, because Trump fell into that same thing of where I truly feel the Ayatollah is no different than any other politician. He says death to America on TV, but behind the scenes, he knows that in reality, if he tried to pursue that, it'd be the end of him and the end of everything he holds dear, Because, if it came down to an all-out war, it would take about 6 months, if that, to go through Iran.
Maybe.
But that's not something. maybe it's not something that should be on the table, which is where I really, um, I never really agree with Tucker Carlson on pretty much almost anything. I agree maybe some principles that he has, but mostly don't. But what I really liked is when he talked to Ted Cruz, he goes, "How can you advocate regime change?" And Ted Cruz didn't even know the population of Iran,
Yeah.
and he didn't even know that they wanted to be called Persians. Ted Cruz is having to tell a U.S. senator who wants to go to war for regime change. Or, I mean, Tucker Carlson's telling Ted Cruz, and I'm sitting there going, I'm like, how are Tucker Carlsons of the world becoming when it comes to war? Let me rephrase that. The voices of reason, because they're sitting there going, hey, this, he's for the most part anti-war. They're going, hey, we don't need to be getting involved in this stuff. It's not our business.
Right.
Like it or not, as much as I don't like the war in Ukraine, it kind of is partially our war because the whole point of Ukraine was to keep the U.S. or NATO and Russia from, being at each other's doorsteps. So kind of yes, kind of no. But the Iran part, it's it depends who you listen to on the level of damage, right?
Mm-hmm.
Some people say months, some people say years. There's some parts of the CIA rumored say the same thing. It's just we probably didn't do as much damage as the president says we did. Because of course he's not going to come out and say, no matter what president it would be, right? They're not going to come out and be like, oh yeah, we screwed up. We didn't get as many as we wanted. Nobody's ever going to say that. That would be like expecting a football coach from a professional team to come out and be like, God, those guys are bums today. It's just something that they're not going to do, But the one thing our government needs to do, Trump needs to do, is distance themselves from Benjamin Netanyahu as fast as they possibly can. Trump had managed before this whole Iranian thing broke out, he managed to get the Arabs to the table. The Iranians were even willing to come to the table to really give Israel a legitimate place in the Middle East.
Right.
And then Israel turns around and does this.
Yeah.
And that's why I loved when Trump looked at the camera and he said, neither one of them got an effing clue. They don't know what the F they're doing, He's like, it's like, thank God somebody finally just came out and said what the American public is thinking.
Well, I would argue that Netanyahu knew exactly what he was doing. He's in trouble politically. So what's the best way to preserve your status? Start a war.
True. I think in terms of Trump was more referring in terms of being able to solve the conflict.
Well, yeah, neither one of Netanyahu doesn't want to solve the conflict. He wants to keep it going. And he reminds me of the kid back in high school that always hung out with the jocks, right? The real skinny kid with the big mouth always hung out with the jocks because if you pick on him, then the jocks have to stick up for him and they beat you up, right? So you leave those kids alone. But that kind of reminds me of that where Israel, as powerful of an army as it has, it is surrounded by sworn enemies, and it will be overpowered without the U.S.'s help. It'll be overpowered. The other countries will make short work of it. I don't want to see that. I certainly don't want to see that. But it doesn't help if they keep pushing the buttons of war all the time, and right. Shoot off their big mouth and expect the jocks to come in and back them up. I think Trump has. I think he's frustrated for two reasons. One is as you said, that this situation is not of his making. But the second thing is he kind of stuck his neck out when he said, we got a peace deal negotiated between these two people now, and it's going to be peace from this point forward. The next thing you know, bombs are blowing up.
Since that, what those couple hours after that one point,
I
think it's been pretty peaceful since.
Yeah, but
I don't think anything's really broke out. I think when he got out on TV and said they don't know what they're doing, everybody was like, "Oh, okay, yeah, he's not going to come back to the table now."
Well, yeah, and I think that worked out to the Iranians' advantage there because I think Netanyahu finally figured out, hey, this guy is just really upset with me now, and I better not push the buttons anymore. I think what's interesting to me is that Iran has been restrained in many ways in their counterattack on U.S. base in Qatar. They pretty much gave warning that it was coming. And yes. I mean, there's a lot of conspiracy theories out there that said even Trump knew about it. I don't know if that's true or not.
They probably both did to save face.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. They're just trying to save face. They're trying to show restraint, and they got to do something, right? They got to do something within like 48 hours. Otherwise, they're not saving face. So I get that, and the fact that, U.S. military, apparently there was no deaths or anything like that. So, I think that what surprises me about Iran is they're pretty pragmatic. I think that was a pretty pragmatic response for that, and it should have just ended right there. I guess it did
Yeah,
as far as U.S. involvement. It probably ended there. We
I
didn't
don't think
drop
they're
any more.
firing any more missiles at each other, are they? Or at least nothing of note that any of us know about.
Not that I've
I
heard
think
of over
that's
the
kind
last.
of calmed down for the
Yeah,
most part.
yeah,
No, but where Israel to me is making a huge mistake is first, Iran runs a lot at the mouth, right? They do. They just yep. They're just one of those countries that's they know that you're not supposed to punch them, but they're going to push every single button that they can to
yeah,
get you to do it. And that's just how they are because they feel that they're justified in how they feel. Which I'm not saying yes or no. It's not my place to say that, but they were goading, right? And Israel decided, and Netanyahu goes, well, here, look, perfect opportunity for me to take the bait to make myself look like I'm doing something. And he's the worst thing for Israel.
yeah,
He's the
yeah.
worst thing for the Middle East, because like I was saying earlier, Donald Trump had the Saudis, the Iranians, some Qatarians, if you want to say that, the UAE. He had Jordan all willing to come down to the table to sit with Israel and get stability done. They were all
Right.
signed on.
Yeah.
They all. He even had the Iranians wanting to come to the table, and it's like Netanyahu went, "Whoa, peace in the Middle East, can't have that,
Can't
buddy."
have that. Yeah.
And if he would have got Israel to the table, that would have been something that got done. That Jimmy Carter got things done. He never got everybody to the table. And not knocking Jimmy Carter, he's one of the best human beings on the planet. All of us could strive to have the heart that man did. But even with his heart, he never got the Middle East to become willing to sit down and go, "Hey, all of them." You know what I mean? To sit
Yeah.
down and
He
go,
got
Yemen
famously
doesn't count. But
he got Israel and Egypt together. He brought together Yasser Arafat and Anwar Sadat together. So there was a very famous. I think that was a good start. I mean, that was,
Mhm.
and that peace is pretty much held. There's some tension between the two countries, but it's pretty much held the peace.
Yeah,
So
yeah. Egypt as well. Their military isn't as powerful as a lot of the others. Their influence in the Middle East is pretty significant. They have a big influence there, which is odd considering over there guns are usually, who has the biggest gun is usually the king of the castle. But that's here nor there. I mean, the whole Iran thing, before we switch is just. I mean, I get why people don't want them to have nuclear bomb. Obama did the same thing. I don't know. Did Biden ever drop bombs on them? I can't think if he did. I don't remember him doing
I
it.
don't know. That's one of the, we talked about Obama earlier. That's one of the big beefs I had with this guy, that he really amped up the campaign of, what was that, the drone bombings. He really amped up. Now, I don't know what all went into it. Obviously, he was subject, or he had access to information I don't have. So I don't know, what all went in on his decision. But yeah, he did that, and so I think that's not going to lessen the tensions between countries. When you have to live in fear of a bomb hitting you at any point, fired from a drone, and really controlled by somebody half a globe away, that's just terrorism. That's actually terrorism, is what it is legalized terrorism, in my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, it pretty much is. One of the things where I definitely agreed with Trump on was the Iran nuclear deal, and I don't think unlike Trump, I don't think there's like the sinister thing behind it. Yeah, I'm not really in that camp, but I'm like, why are we giving money to these people?
Well,
First,
yeah, you got to go back in
it
history, though. That goes way, way back to the 1970s, really.
right. Well, yeah, I mean, I get it, but I'm like, why are we helping them with any sort of aspect? Like, they should be, hey, you shouldn't have a nuclear bomb. You know,
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of conspiracy theories that draw the line between Iran getting a nuclear bomb and then getting that money back that was theirs in the first place. Yeah, I think part of playing politics is that you have to face your what were once enemies and try to negotiate with them. And part of that negotiation for peace may be to settle the financial debts that were there. And I think that's what they were attempting to do. But again, I'm not privileged.
yeah, I mean,
I'm not.
I
I'm
wish I
not.
was.
I don't have that level of information available to me, so I don't know what exactly went into that. I do know that. I mean, I brought this up the other day too. I don't know. This goes back quite a ways, back to the 1980s, but Oliver North got very famous by selling arms to Iran. He delivered, I don't know how many, two big jumbo jets full of arms to Iran, and Iran paid him money, which he then used to, fund the Contras. And that was, I mean, a lot of people forget about that, but it's just,
The Iran Contra scandal, yeah.
yeah, that was
They
a
almost took
huge
Reagan
thing,
down.
and that was basically saying, okay, we can use Iran for whenever we want to do things. We're not going to stick to our principles here, and that just kind of ruined everything, in my opinion. It really tainted Reagan in his last year of office. It really put
Yeah,
a
it did.
black mark against him. So, anyways, I
Yeah,
brought that up
for
as kind of
sure.
a side note. I didn't want to go too far into it.
Oh yeah, no, for sure. It's it's definitely a bummer that we're like in this mode of having to discuss this about Iran. You know what I mean? They're just, I don't know. I guess me personally, outside of the nuclear aspect, they really don't pose much of a threat to us. More of a threat to Israel, but to the United States, they're no different than in terms of a threat to us.
Yes and no. I mean, they threaten Israel, and indirectly, because we are committed to Israel, they threaten us, and they have been known to fund a lot of the terrorist cells in that area and causing a lot of instability. I mean, I don't cut them a whole lot of slack, but I think that it's small peanuts compared to what's going on now. But I don't know. I mean, when you're living in Israel, I've been there a couple times and just visiting. Well, not visiting, but I was on business trips. But it's gotta work on you a little bit when you're trying to live your daily life, knowing that you're surrounded by sworn enemies. And I think that really works on you after a while, works on your psyche after a while.
Oh
And
yeah,
it gets taken out, unfortunately, on the Palestinians in both Gaza and the West Bank. And you mix a little bit of religious righteousness with it as well, and it's a recipe for disaster. The Palestinians are just continuously being pushed off of their land. This has been going on
it's
since 1947. They're continuously being pushed off their land, and I got into a really good discussion with a Israeli here when I was out knocking on doors last year. I says, "Yeah, can I count on your vote?" He says, "Well, let me ask you, what do you think about Gaza?" And I says, "Well, it needs to stop." And of course, that was not what he wanted to hear from me. And so he tried to tell me how the Palestinians actually sold this land to the Israelis. And so they don't really have any rights to it anymore. And I said, wait a minute, I don't think so, right? So I went home and I just researched it and found out, yeah, they did. Back in like 1907, when a lot of Israelis were moving into that area, they were coming in from Europe before World War II. They were coming in with quite a bit of money. And sure, the Palestinians who were there sold them a lot of that land. So yeah, they own a lot of Jewish people in Israel legitimately own that land. What they don't own though is the occupied territories. They don't own that, and a lot of that land is unparceled as well. Anybody that tries to bring up that argument, I'd say, man, you're like 100 years behind. That may exist 100 years ago, but it doesn't exist now.
right.
So, yeah, that
Yeah, that's
it's a tough situation. There's both sides of the story. I understand it, but right now, what I do when I turn on the videos and look at some of the videos out there, what I see are kids being mutilated in
yes.
Gaza, and it upsets me to no end. And if that were happening here in the United States, if that were happening there in Michigan or here in Missouri, man, the military would be all over it lickety split, and nobody would put up with that here. Well, why are we putting it up with it over there then?
Right. We need to tell Israel they need to stop. I get Israel's position on, there probably is a lot of terrorists that are using their children to hide behind in hospitals. I'm not going to argue that because that's surely what a lot of those groups do. But at the same time, you're also killing more innocent people than you are terrorists. And these kids are going to remember what's happening to their mom and dad or what happens to them. And then when they grow up, they're going to remember that Israel did it if we funded it. And I'm not arguing that, a lot of these terrorists are terrible people. But at some point, we have to go, are we making the problem worse? And it's like, what is Israel getting out of furthering this conflict? I guess, I don't live there, right? So I'll probably never know the full complexities of it. But Gaza, it's not like Gaza has all these crazy resources or all this stuff. Like at this point, it just seems like it's more of a political or a posturing than it is anything else.
Well, before the bombing started, Gaza was actually pretty rich in terms of its culture, and it actually had lots of universities there, and some top universities as well. So, I mean, there was what they with what little they had, they made quite a bit out of it. I was going to go back to one thing you talked about. Terrorists are terrible people, but I would say terrorists aren't born terrorists. Terrorists are manufactured,
True.
and they're
Yes.
manufactured, and that's why that's another reason. Go back to Obama doing his bombing campaign through drones. Yeah, you hit the target, but you also take out about 10 or 15 people around the target, some of which are kids being maimed or killed, or parents being killed or maimed. You've just now, yeah, you may have taken out one terrorist, but now you just manufactured five more. And
Right.
that's the terrible thing about this war. Yeah, you say, Israel is killing children, but yet they have the right to defend themselves. So, how do you deal with a culture that hides behind their own children? And I'd say they got you somewhat over a barrel, but I would say it's time to begin negotiating, because I don't think that there's any other solution other than getting kids killed. There's no other
Yeah.
solution.
Yeah. I mean, like I had said, when it first happened, I mean, who could argue that, right? If somebody would have done something like that to our citizens in one of our towns, we'd all reacted the same way. Israel had every right to go in there when that first happened, every right. But to me, it's kind of one of those things where go away and do what you got to do. Now it's time to go home. It's time. It's time to go back home.
A little fact for you too: if you total up all the Palestinians that were killed in the West Bank and Gaza prior to October 7th, it ends up being a higher number than the number of Jewish people that were killed on October 7th. And but what happens? It happens in onesies and twosies, right? The Palestinian settlers, I mean, the Israeli settlers go out into Palestinian territory and kill a Palestinian or something. This doesn't even make the news here, but it accumulates over 10 years, right? And so you end up, after 10 years, you end up with more dead bodies. And I don't want to go back to like Vietnam where we're counting bodies or anything like that. But if you want to put any sort of a price on a human life, it's pretty asymmetric. It was asymmetric before October 7th, and it's really asymmetric now.
Yeah, it's it's an unfortunate situation. I mean,
Yeah.
my hearts go
It's
out to those folks.
it's if I were there, I mean, if I had anything to say with it, I would just say, okay, let's talk. They
Yeah,
got their representative Cotter, go to Cotter and start talking and say, look, ceasefire, let the food in, for God's sakes, let the kids eat, and let's talk.
yeah.
And
I mean, there's no harm in it. Letting them talk. But it's that's above my pay grade. Unfortunately, I wish I
you
had
and me
more
both.
influence.
It's really easy to sit here and say this. We're safe, several thousand miles away. We're safe. I get that.
But changing topics to obviously my probably favorite topic ever is the RFK thing, and how I always kind of feel like there's always a lot to disagree with the man on, but came out with the insurance, and hey, we're essentially taking it to them to a degree with pre-authorizations. Now, it's not everything is going to be automatic,
Hmm.
but as long as it's like something that's a common practice, you have certain things, boom, boom, boom. I think they're probably going to use AI. They didn't say that, but I mean, it's really about the only way you can make it automatic. Is they're probably going to do something along those lines. And I have an HMO now, but prior to this year, I had a PPO with my employer. I had the well, they call it the executive plan, but it went from several years ago, $120 paycheck to $400 paycheck now for that. And I was like, you know what? I don't use it enough to justify it, but it was nice because the deductible was only $250.
Right.
And for private insurance, that's crazy. And it was, ER visit, $20. But now that HMO, when I had to get a shot in my knee, yeah, I partially torn my meniscus. And they're like, "Oh, we don't really like cutting it open until either A, it completely tears, or B, it gets to a point where you can't walk because of your age, you're younger."
Hmm.
And they said it's just one of those things where you got to keep going back once they cut it open. But it took like 3 weeks before I could go in and see the orthopedic surgeon to get that shot and all that because I had to wait for the authorization. The insurance was like, "Well, your doctor didn't code this completely correct or that," and then it was and a lot of what RFK went after is just kind of eliminating that process and just going, if it's a broken ankle, it's a broken ankle. You shouldn't need to worry about if the I's dotted or not. You know what I mean? If your doctor can clearly establish, boom, 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 this is what it is, there should be no issue. And like I had said, Dr. Oz said is, hey, people are getting violent about this stuff. We have to address the problem. And I felt like, it's like, okay, hey, RFK he's one of those guys where, like or not like him, he's doing some things that are actually going to benefit people.
Mm-hmm.
To me, this whole thing that he's doing with the authorization, something that's kind of been a Democratic item for, Democrats wanting to go after those type of issues for my whole life. And I think this is the first time I can ever say, because I don't feel like Obamacare did anything to address insurance. All it did was give them a blank check. And I'm not knocking Obamacare because I get the purpose behind it, but it didn't actually address the problem.
It shifted the problem to the government instead of to
Yeah.
the people. Yeah,
it didn't go after the cost.
yeah, the insurance company still made a buttload of money on it, really.
Well, yeah. All Obamacare did is go, okay, Blue Cross, how much do you want for 100 million people? All right, here you go. There was no, why do you keep raising your insurance rates 30% every year? People aren't making enough claims there's not enough claims out there. There we go. There's not enough claims out there to justify a 30% increase, compared to what they're bringing in. Yeah, I'm sure there's situations where it is, right? I'm sure you can, find years or cherry pick the data to get, oh, look, yeah, this year. But, my employer had taught me that, their rates get decided on how much they pull out versus how much they put in. And that's how, and I'm like, man, it just doesn't make sense. First, most of these insurance companies are supposed to be nonprofits.
Yeah.
Blue Cross is supposed to be a nonprofit. I mean, it's supposed to be. When a supposed to be nonprofit clears a couple $1 billion in revenue after expenses, I call that a profit. They can change the word however they want to change it, but yeah, you're profiting off of people, and you could have easily went back and turned that back into lower premiums.
Right. Well,
And they don't.
I think the last time we talked about this, it was was that observation was we pay over $12,000 per person per year for all medical related things. That's insurance, co-pays that you pay, everything on down the line. Whereas the next closest, I haven't looked up the numbers since last time we talked. It's been a while since I looked at them, but the next closest country is somewhere around $8,000. We are an outlier. We are way, way over what other countries
Oh yeah.
pay. We're about twice of what Canada pays. And yeah, I mean, I get, I don't know exactly what RFK is doing in this area, but if he's trying to address this, I'd say more power to him from this for doing that. I'm against him on a whole lot of other things. The problem is how you go about it is really a difficult thing because if you look at who's getting money from insurance companies, who's getting all that campaign money, it's people on both sides of the aisle, quite honestly.
Oh yeah, and he said that when he was going on the hearing, some people are coming after him. He said that to both Republicans and Democrats. He goes, "Well, that's funny because he had all the receipts." He goes, "That's funny because you took X amount of dollars from
Right,
him."
right.
And he said, "So you're coming over here telling me that I don't care, or that I'm per se quote unquote anti-vax all the way, right?" He's like, "But you took money from all these companies. You were saying, and a lot of these vaccine studies were done by companies who make the vaccines."
Yeah, yeah.
And would anybody trust a health study on heart attacks from McDonald's? No,
Exactly.
they would look at it and be like, of course that's self-serving. Well, yeah, the pharmaceutical companies are not going to put out any kind of thing where, it's going to hurt their product. No company would. And I'm not saying like, oh, we should get rid of vaccines, but there was some where I forgot the guy that RFK had on his podium, but and then I read, and it's true, some of the vaccines they're giving infants and children didn't go through the placebo trial.
Mm-hmm.
Some, not all. But I'm like, well, for me, that right there is a red flag, and that should have been pulled off right away. I'm not saying that kids should never get the vaccine,
Right.
but how do you know the full effect if you haven't seen that? If you haven't done what every other medication we pretty much give kids and give adults, all went through the same thing.
I'm gonna play devil's advocate for you though, because a lot of times these medical trials are so long and so drawn out, people literally die, right? Waiting for their medications, waiting for the so-called miracle cures. Like a year after you die, suddenly the cure comes out. They're doing some wonderful things with cancer treatment these days. But so I think that the trials in some cases should go a little faster, especially when someone's dealing with a terminal illness. The trials should go a little bit faster. They should be able to experiment with people with their permission. But yeah, so I mean, no, I'm just playing devil's advocate here because there's really two sides to consider here. The fact that they haven't gone through all of their trials correctly, I really can't comment on that too much because
it makes me nervous more than I don't want to say like nervous, but it makes me look at it and go, huh,
yeah,
And then when he says, hey, when they started doing this, you see the correlation between different things going on,
mm-hmm.
and they're like, well, there's no scientific research behind it. And I'm like, well, yeah, nobody's dumped the kind of money they've dumped into to prove their point right, to prove their
Right.
point wrong either. You can cherry pick any statistic, no matter which side you're on. But sometimes that's why when it's things like that, what he's saying is he goes, hold on.
Sounds like you're being attacked by Tinkerbell over there.
It reminds me to look at numbers. Sunday night, 8 o'clock. Look at your numbers. I don't know if I would have took the action that he did and got rid of the whole vaccine panel, pretty much, right? But I'm not necessarily against the principle behind it. For me, the whole COVID vaccine situation really brought that to light. And I'm not necessarily against the COVID vaccine. And, contrary to what people think, and from just what I've heard from his own mouth, is he's not saying, hey, we need to get rid of it. He's just saying it's something that shouldn't be forced on you.
Mm-hmm.
If you and your doctor, and he even said, if you and your doctor feel this is something that you should have, then yes, it should be available, and yes, it should be covered. But he's just going, it shouldn't be required for people who need it. Like he was saying, like, young, healthy children, where if they got this, things of that nature, which I'm going, okay. I guess to me that makes a lot of sense when you look at our European counterparts who approach things differently. They spread the vaccine schedule for infants and kids out a lot more. And their disease rates and everything are significantly less than the United States. They don't have a lot of these things in their food supply, their water, and they're not facing the same hurdles we are. So when people are like, well, there's not like a concrete study behind it, I'm like, well, you're not wrong. You also can't, you look at Europe as a continent, and then you look at the United States, very similar diets in terms of our preferences, right? But we create those products differently. And they're enjoying much longer, happier lives now, where it used to be the opposite.
Yeah, I would also question some of those numbers as well. I know when COVID was going on, I was doing a lot of diving in on the research and trying to figure out, and it was very preliminary at that point. I would say this much: when it comes to a pandemic, though, especially a deadly pandemic, and I think COVID wasn't highly deadly. It killed 1 million people in the U.S., so it might be kind of insensitive for me to say that. But I'm saying it wasn't like a 20% death rate or something like Ebola or whatever that would cause. But it is a public disease. It's not a private disease. When you say, yeah, I have a choice, and I'm just throwing this out there. I'm not making a judgment one way or the other, but when you say it's my choice, my body, my choice, I get that, okay? But then when you talk to somebody else and you stand close to them and you breathe on them, now it's their body, your choice. And so we live in a well-connected society. I've got a horror story really about I was in India. I arrived late at night. They lost my luggage and I missed my cab. 3 o'clock in the morning, I'm finally getting out of the airport in Bangalore, trying to work my way back to the hotel. Never been there before. I've been there since, but I haven't been. That was my first trip there. And next thing you know, I'm on this bus, just packed full of people. You've seen those videos of people packed on buses hanging out the side. Well, that was me inside there, just hanging on to whatever my carry-on luggage was, and just breathing the air everybody else is breathing. So I'm thinking to myself, okay, every disease that exists, I was living in Los Angeles at the time, every disease that exists in Los Angeles is now being exposed to all these people in this bus. Furthermore, in another week and a half or 2 weeks, or whatever, I'm going to go back to LA. I'm going to pick up any disease I've got here back to LA, right? And that's okay. I mean, it just surprises me how lax all of our governments are when it comes to this. But when it comes to a real pandemic, you can't afford these situations. People are going to die. And, I think it's a civic duty to get yourself vaccinated, because what you're really trying to do is you're not cutting down so much on whether you are going to get sick if you get exposed, because you'll still get sick. But what you're trying to do is narrow that window of time that you're contagious to other people. And if we can narrow it down enough, we can kill that disease. Because right now we can't do what they did back in the old days, which was isolate people. That can't work anymore. That doesn't work. We're a well-connected society. So that's what this whole thing, that's what this conundrum was all about. How do we fix this? How do we cure this public disease when it takes participation from every private member of community and to protect those that are vulnerable? I chose to do the responsible thing, which was to get myself vaccinated, so I'm not the one that's out there spreading the disease. I covered myself. I didn't cover myself. I didn't wear a mask so much for myself. I wore it for everybody else too.
Yeah,
And
I got the first 2 Pfizer shots, and now ironically, I kind of have a weird COVID story, if you want to call it that. I got, so it was before they really came out with the vaccine. My wife worked for a hospital system. Well, technically still does, but they've been bought and sold. And they had done a urology study.
mm-hmm.
It was like, I think it was March of when COVID had first came out. So it was very early on. I'd already had it. I was like, oh, I didn't even know I had it.
Wow. Yeah.
Now, my wife had been sick for like 4 or 5 weeks, but at the time, they just kept telling her, you got a sinus infection. It was before they knew COVID was around, but they didn't, it was very in its beginning stages. My kids had both had it. I had it. The 3 of us never knew we had it. And so then fast forward, I'm like, okay, hey, I seen what it had done to my wife. And I'm like, well, man, I don't want to go through that. So I'm like, all right, let me get the vaccine. 5.5, 6 months later, whatever it was, I caught COVID again. Worst experience of my life. And I sat right there and I'm looking, I'm like, I get that over time it wears off and then you get a booster. I'm like, but good Lord, I thought this was supposed to help strengthen your body overall for it. I'm like, I got sicker now. And I get that it mutates.
Right.
But I'm just going, I'm like, and then you got my wife. Okay, my wife is allergic to the flu vaccine.
Mm-hmm.
She gets anaphylactic shock when she gets it.
Wow.
And back in 2004, she wasn't before, but back in 2014, she got the shot, and then I came home from work, and she was just a red balloon. And I had to take her straight to the hospital. So, she ended up getting exempted from the COVID vaccine, right? Well, every other time my wife got COVID from that, a couple of days, she's fine. I had COVID after I had the vaccine. It was like 10 days for like the first 5 days. And this is even after my doctor had prescribed me Paxlovid,
Mm-hmm.
Which, don't get me wrong, Paxlovid did help.
Yeah.
It made life worth a living.
Yeah.
Because those first couple of days I was going, you know what? If this is my time, let it happen in my sleep. I don't want to know. I just don't want to feel like this no more. And my wife's like, don't talk like that. I'm like, I'm in so much pain. My fever would be 104.
Wow.
I'd close my eyes for a second, and then it would come up and it'd be 101. Close my eyes for a second, 104.
Wow.
Like it was just,
yeah.
And so finally I called my doctor, and I'm like, man, I was like, I know you said that the vaccine would help me. I was like, I'm not blaming you, but I was like, but I'm not taking another one of those shots again. I was like, what I had seen my wife, go through, and then my kids. We had got my 15-year-old the 1 shot for COVID. And then when he seen what I went through after it, he was like, I don't want that. It was weird. And I'm not, like, I get why a lot of people got it. You know what I mean? And I was even, hey, okay, I think this is a good thing to get, right? Because even President Trump at the time was, hey, this is something you should do. But I guess, for me, at least when you get the flu vaccine, and it's good for a year, but if you get the flu vaccine, it at least makes the flu not as bad.
That's the whole idea behind it, right? It doesn't kill you.
And the COVID vaccine it's not as effective as the flu vaccine. And I think that's where, and then plus people go, the flu vaccines people are iffy about it because it doesn't work as effective as pretty much every other vaccine they give you. It's like a temporary protection. And then they look at COVID and they're like, you're telling me you want me to keep getting it more often and more often and more often. And then they're going, and then you hear, hey, the pharmaceuticals got a 75-year exemption. And they're going, 1 plus 1 is not equal to 2 in this situation. Something's not right. And I don't know if it is or not, right? Because I know there's a lot of people, like my mom had it, 0 issues with it. she's had COVID a couple times since then. Nothing big, But me, and that's why I think where I guess I fall in line with the RFK line, right? Where it's like, hey, if this isn't for you, that's okay. You know what I mean? But at the same time, you also got to recognize if that's not for you and another COVID breaks out, you're going to be stuck in your house. Oh, everybody else in that
Right.
situation, I would say it's fair game.
Yeah.
Because
You're still looking at it. You're still taking responsibility for it, though, right? I mean, if you do get infected, the instant you know you're infected is shut off all contact with
yeah,
anybody else, right? Yeah.
yeah, that was hard for my kids when I was locked in our bedroom for 10 days. My 6 year old's technically autistic, right? But he was just like, he's like, how come I can't go in and see dad? How
Yeah.
come I can't
Yeah.
go in and see dad?
But
And eventually, I just moved out to the garage.
you're taking you're taking a responsible approach to it, and I think most people do. But there are a lot of people out there that didn't take responsibility for it.
Oh yeah, no, and they did it to prove a point.
Yeah, and they did it to prove a point, and they're out there spreading it. We have a very politician here, Vicky Hartzler, who used to be the U.S. Congress member from Missouri's 5th district, I think it was. Well, she and her husband were anti-vaxxers, and they were going out not changing their lifestyle at all during COVID. And this was even after the vaccine came out. I think the vaccine came out in end of 2020, I think it was. This is like halfway through 2021. Well, they both got COVID, and she got pretty sick, but her husband ended up dying from it. And it's on one hand I feel bad, but she, on the other hand, it's like, she had some comments online. She said, "Oh, my husband was taken from me, and God didn't answer my prayers," or something to that effect. And I'm like, "Well, God did answer your prayer. It's called the vaccine, right? And you may still have died even if you've taken the vaccine. Chances are you would have lived, though. Your husband would have lived." And so, to me, that's just, it's too stubborn for their own good. And
Yeah,
I don't like to
some
see that
people
kind
are.
of stuff, and I don't like to see people getting infected and then intentionally going out there and just pretending like life is business as usual when they're going out there and infecting other people who maybe, like your wife, can't take the vaccine. So, that limits their freedom as well. So there's some civic responsibility that comes into this, but I also agree that, and I think some of the sentiment you would probably agree with too, that we completely blew this whole thing. We were
Oh yeah,
completely
big time.
unprepared for handling it, as not only as a
Yeah,
society but as a government. We were completely
yeah.
unprepared to handle it.
Clinton said it. Bush said it. Obama said it. All three presidents said, "Yeah, if something happens, we're we're not prepared." And I know people have conspiracy theories about it, but it seems like in human history, every 100 to 150 years or so, there's some new like disease that comes out.
Yeah, yeah,
But I guess for and to me and in this aspect, I think people are justified in a little bit of their skepticism of the situation. Is where now the virus is real, right? Its spreading was real, the mutating was real, all of that, 1,000%. I very rarely find even conservatives who are anti-vaxxers that they pull wasn't real. A lot of them do, but where a lot of people are, and I watched this, what I call a documentary, but it boiled back down to Dr. Fauci. Now, do I think Dr. Fauci was sitting here like, I want to get the world COVID? No, not really. But when you start following the money trail from him, and he benefited a
yeah,
lot, and
yeah.
everybody, and they had banned that kind of testing in the United States, and then his money and a lot of that money went to the Wuhan lab in China, and that's the only COVID lab in the world that's publicly known. And at that point, you're kind of, I think it's fair for people to sit there and go, well, they told you couldn't do it here. So you shipped your money over there. And now your guy linked to it telling us we're all paranoid. But your lab let it out. They're going, oh, it was from a bat. No, I think somebody probably screwed something up because they're human beings at that lab too. That or maybe they were trying to do some kind of experiment with people. But I think it got out and it got out of control. And at that point, everybody was just kind of like, I don't know which way it's going. And they were just like, let's hope for the best. And I truly believe that after I started looking up, because I believe we banned that kind of testing in what, the 80s or 90s, that's when that kind of really started getting phased out here. With the with, viruses and developing things like that. And then it's like magic. They were showing like Fauci's money and like how his public donations go. Right? All of it kind of started funneling right towards Wuhan, China.
Yeah, it's. You ever read The Stand from Stephen King? You should read it. It's about this exact scenario where a lab in the United States. He wrote this back in like the early '80s. I read it back then. It was one of the best Stephen King books I read. But it deals exactly with that. A lab that's experimenting, a super flu virus escapes and literally just wipes out 98% of the population. So that's what Stephen King writes about that. And he puts a lot of other weird stuff in there, as Stephen King is prone to do. But that book, when I read that, it got me very interested in this topic and very interested in how viruses take hold and how they spread. Having a research lab like that, like Wuhan has, it's kind of a damned if you do and damned if you don't sort of thing, because there are a lot of viruses out there that we haven't even discovered yet. That's buried deep back in the jungles of Thailand or whatever. And as soon as we start penetrating into that area with society, people are going to catch it. There's Ebola vaccines in Africa as well, that occasionally these things break out from the jungle, and we're going to be prepared to handle them. So if you don't research these viruses, these things are going to wipe you out quickly.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, you're right. If you research these viruses and some numbskull, and there's a numbskull in every crowd, I tell you, one in every crowd, someone's going to drop a test tube or somebody's going to sneeze and whatever. It's just it's human nature. Like you said, it's going to happen. So I don't know how to answer that conundrum actually, because you got to be prepared, but the act of preparing yourself could actually do you in too.
Right. Well, what made the situation even more suspicious is when Fauci got a preemptive pardon,
Yeah, there's a whole lot
and
of
that
stuff that went on behind the scenes there.
and
The whole
you're just kind
denial.
of going, yeah, you're just kind of going, you're like, if things went the way you said they went, why do you need a pardon? Because even if his money's going there, right? Because a lot of research money goes to a lot of places we all don't know about. But if there was nothing that was like about that situation, why would you need that preemptive pardon? And where last points of that is, there was a lot of rumors when Trump first, when the CIA first started talking about everyone, when he started calling it the China virus, and everybody's going, well, it's being racist. And yeah, he could have used some better terminology for sure, but I don't think he was trying to be racist about it. When he even said it, it's a virus from China, so that's why I'm calling it the China virus. Terrible wording, but he wasn't wrong. Everybody's, oh, you're paranoid, you don't know. Well, then, right after Trump gets elected, I don't remember, it was a week, 2, 3 weeks, the CIA comes out and goes, well, yeah, now we do have some kind of proof that it came from that lab.
Yeah.
And then, not right long after that, or right before that, Fauci had gotten pardoned.
Well, that pardon right there, I'm going to play devil's advocate again. There was a lot of talk coming from Trump about persecuting or prosecuting and persecuting his political enemies. And I think Biden just felt compelled to start issuing pardons right and left just to protect everybody as a preemptive protection. And honestly, I don't blame him. He issued pardons even to his own son because and this is what I honestly believe. I don't believe Biden was pardoning his son because he was complicit in any sort of. He wasn't pardoning his son because he was trying to keep his son out of trouble that his son actually got into. I think what it was that he knew his son would never get a fair trial in this political environment. So he did what he could to protect him. And I think the same thing with Fauci too, is I don't know with all the conspiracy theories floating around, some of them true, some of them not. Not all conspiracy theories are wrong. But with the wild conspiracy theories floating around, I just don't know if somebody can get a fair trial in that environment.
This should have been a little bit more of a public investigation on that
Yeah,
situation.
I
We
agree.
all could have got knowledge.
We should
And I
have
think,
made a public and open and transparent investigation.
yeah,
Absolutely.
I think if that would have been the case, people may not be like, so like, I want to say like, hey, arrest Fauci, or probably not even as anti-COVID vaccine as they are.
Mhm.
But the way everything was handled just made it look like as if those were your kids acting like that, and you were the parent. You'd go, you're up to something.
Yeah. Yeah.
You would automatically think they're up to something sneaky. And that, because when people think of a vaccine, they think of, well, the one that, I don't know why RFK is messing with it, the measles vaccine, right? But it prevents measles. It doesn't slow the measles down. It doesn't kind of make it better. No, it prevents measles. And so people are going, hey, you're telling me this thing hasn't even been tested. It don't even prevent the disease.
Yeah.
So I think that, that's just, I think that's kind of where some people go with it. But I think that's just a very rudimentary way of looking at it. Um, but also, in a pandemic, can you even really be prepared?
Oh,
Like,
I think you can. I think the fact that we were short on masks, we were short on ventilators. We, as far as I know, and this may be a conspiracy theory as well, but I thought we had more observers all around the world looking for these types of outbreaks, and that we'd pulled way back on the number of observers out there. So we lost some precious time in the very beginning there. So absolutely, I think you can prepare for these things. It's like a tornado warning, right? I mean, you can't stop the tornado from hitting your house, but you can certainly, if you have 2 or 3 minutes warning, you can certainly, grab your kids and your pets or whatever and get down to the basement and save everybody. So that's the
yeah.
situation we're in.
And the problem is a lot of the most suspicious people in our political and business atmospheres and realms were all involved in it.
Mm-hmm.
And it wasn't like it was, let's say, would have happened under Obama or under Bush, or under Clinton or Reagan, where it'd have been, hey, let's all try to do the right thing. We're going to march to the beat of the same drum. It was chaos. Nobody trusted,
Well,
especially
that's
once, yeah. I mean, Fauci, even before that, didn't really have a very good reputation among a lot of circles. He did within certain government research circles, but I didn't know this because, to be honest, before that, I had no idea who the man was.
mm-hmm.
But before that, he had, there was some suspicion surrounding him in certain areas, more conspiracy, but, the 80s and the whole AIDS thing, that made people kind of go, hey, why is this guy even in a position of power? The AIDS thing right there, to me, once I learned about that, I'm going, why? He should have never even been in that spot to begin with after that.
Right.
When you're dealing with people's lives and you do that and you pretty much shrug your shoulders off at it, you should never be in a position to affect people like that again. And I feel like, and I'm not blaming that on any politician or any party. I think that was an error in judgment big time on whoever put that man in that spot. I don't think they did it with bad intentions. I had somebody once tell me, he's definitely a conservative, but he said, really smoke this fire.
Yeah, there's smoke. Yes, that may be true. There's fire, but you don't know where that fire is. You just see the smoke. I mean, it doesn't mean that your conspiracy theory is correct just because you see the smoke. But you hit upon something there, which I wanted to touch on that a bit because and this may be taking us in a slightly different direction. But you use the word trust there, and that's something that has been lost between the citizens and their government. And I think that that was an intentional thing. And
Mm-hmm.
I remember when Reagan was first elected. Yes, I voted for him. It was 1980. His inaugural address in 1981, he said, and this is a very famous line, I'm sure you've heard it, the government isn't the solution to our problem, the government is the problem. And that kicked off a series of cascading events that undermined people's trust in their government. And it's at an all-time low at this point. So even if the government would have appointed a special blue ribbon panel to investigate Fauci, there is so little trust in our government at this point that even if these people did a great job and were transparent about it, there'd be a whole lot of people out there saying, no, 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 he's wrong. He's wrong. Where there's smoke, there's fire. I know the fire's burning over here, not over there. You can't function like this. I'm sorry, but you just can't. A government can't function like this. So the government, I think, needs to take another attitude and say, look, we will earn your trust. Okay, don't give it to us. We must earn it every single day. But don't go around saying the government isn't the solution to the problem. The government is the problem. No, oftentimes the government is the solution to the problem. In the case of the pandemic, yeah, I think we screwed the pooch on that one. But it's not because there weren't smart people in charge. It's because a lot of people didn't trust the government to begin with. A lot of projects were underfunded or not funded at all. As I said, the masks weren't there, the ventilators weren't there, the the messaging wasn't there. All this stuff, we just let it go, right? We knew the Spanish flu hit 100 years ago, but we just sort of forgot about that. This all comes down to trust and people really learning to demand trust from their government, and the government learning how to earn the trust of the people. We got to rebuild that trust.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, trust is everything. I mean, that's how our currency works. We have a fiat system.
Yeah,
You know,
exactly.
it works in trust in it. And if people don't believe in it, which I mean, sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. Currently, it just depends on the day and which way our current president, flicks the switch.
Yeah.
That kind of really impacts that. But the trust. I think Reagan's what spurred his position. He was kind of like that before he ran for president. But Watergate
Hmm.
really pushed that. Certain failures in the Carter administration that the public did, like the Iran situation, some other small things in there, right? And then the economy, right? Everybody just kind of viewed as, hey, man, we're getting taxed to high heavens and we ain't got nothing to show for it. So America at the time just seems like from news. Obviously, I wasn't, involved in any of that, but it just kind of seems like, you got the Vietnam situation what really started killing the trust in the government. And then you have Watergate. And then you have the Iran scandal. So that that was just like it was like a boom, boom, boom. And then you got somebody going up there, hey, I hate to tell everybody, but these guys are the problem.
Yeah.
And people were like, well, yeah, when you kind of step back and look at it, they are. And to a degree he wasn't wrong.
Right.
But it goes back to what I've always said about the 17th Amendment. We wouldn't be in this situation if our senators were appointed and not elected. The interests and the problems that our states have, like California, Michigan, we're what they call donor states, right? And we have different interests. It would just be more represented at the federal level, where right now is, the governor of your state essentially has to go into the president's office and sit there and play, I won't say lapdog, but, please, Mr. President, represent us. Whereas the whole point of the Senate was the group that was supposed to do that, to function like that, so you didn't have these situations. I don't think we'd be $38 trillion in debt if we had a Senate that was accountable to the states, because the states don't want a weak economy. They don't want a massive deficit. They don't want our currency floundering and not being the reserve for the states would be like, hey, whoa, 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 we got a problem here. This is hurting all of us.
Hmm.
And I don't think you would have seen the decline in manufacturing, the decline in the middle class, if the Senate would have had the power, because the Senate would go, hey, they were supposed to serve as like, the yin and yang to the House.
Right.
And where public sentiment didn't just whip it all up and get things going like it kind of does now. And, all that stuff's important, but, I could probably go on. I'm just I'll say staunch opposition, but I definitely have my issues with the 17th Amendment. 17th Amendment, I could write a book on why I opposed that. I get why it was passed. At the time it made a lot of sense, but now with how our society sits now and how, if you sniff the wrong way, you got about 9 people whistleblowing on you.
Yeah.
I feel like it's an outdated amendment.
Yeah, I don't know. I think that the amendment had a pretty good basis on it, but honestly, I haven't looked into it enough to really comment intelligently about it. But I personally, as a citizen, I feel better when I can vote for my senator rather than having my representative vote for my senator. And I get why it was set up that way, from the Constitution originally. But these days, I just I just feel more comfortable being more in
No,
control of things. There's a whole lot of things about this, about the structure of our Constitution that have kind of messed us up and really made it possible for minority rule in this country. And one of them is the way they set up the senators. Another one is the electoral system for president. Just to make a joke about this, it's that if you live in California and you want to vote 3 times for president, you can do it. You can do it legally. All you have to do is move to Wyoming, because your vote in Wyoming, because Wyoming only has, they have less than, I think they have like somewhere around 600 to 650,000 people. You get 3 electoral votes. But if you work out the math, uh, California has what, 2 electoral votes, somewhere in that area. Divide that by the population, you find out that people in Wyoming have 3 times the voting power as people in California. when it comes to
Yeah, which is why
presidential
the
elections.
Republicans go after the rural states.
Yeah, so it's that's why sometimes people make the argument that real estate can vote. You see these maps out there that say, well, here's the red territory and here's the blue territory, and the blue territories are like little dots where all the cities are, and the red territory is all that open land where nobody lives anyways. But so it's like, okay, the argument there is that real estate votes, which it does to some degree.
Oh,
That
yeah.
I don't think that's right, but
In the last election, it seemed like a good chunk of the country, and even minorities at that, a lot shifted towards the right. Like even in California, it's shifted more right than it has been probably since the Reagan
well,
times.
it's the Overton window. I think that somebody was talking to somebody yesterday. I was representing the Democrats in a fair here, and he said the Overton window has shifted. He said the Democrats today are where the Republicans were back in the 1980s, and I haven't given that much thought, but on the surface, it sounded pretty good. I have to give it more thought to really agree with that, but it's a good observation, though, nevertheless.
Yeah, well, I think California's debt problem is a big reason why they're shifting towards the right, because I think Gavin Newsom is, I don't know the guy super well, but sometimes he'll jump on the show and make a whole lot of sense. And I'm like, okay, some of this actually seems reasonable. But then the next day he'll come out in a press conference and he'll say the most crazy thing that he's ever said before. And I'm like, so are you center left or are you left?
Well, I could say the same thing about Trump. Every time I listen to the guy,
oh yeah, no, it's for sure. Well, I had kind of thought, I don't know how you are, like, with the sports thing, right? Like I have zero. I don't think there needs to be any laws against transgenders. Nothing of that. Zero issue with LGBT. I just don't think in schools is where, I think that's more like where parents come in rather than an educator in a classroom kind of telling your kids how to think. But I also just, if adult sports leagues want to have that kind of stuff, totally fine. But I just don't think we should be having the sex war or gender identification war inside of public institutions.
Well, there's a reason for that, and you're right. There is I'm the same way as you. I don't. It doesn't bother me if someone wants to be cross dresser or whatever, change your gender or whatever. To me, I'm fine. But there's a reason that it has become an issue. It's because it's something that the Republicans have found they can beat over the head with the Democrats. The Democrats feel compelled, and I think rightfully so, they feel compelled to stand up for civil rights because at this point, the Republicans don't seem to be doing it that much. But the problem is that it's almost a red herring in a sense because Republicans are making a whole lot more out of it than what it really is. In Missouri here, they've made a big issue out of it. And I think there's something like they tracked it down to like 6 people that this might affect, that it might affect, right? In terms of of men playing women's sports. Which, by the way, I unfortunately, but I do have to support that position that women's sports should be for women because it's only fair to them. And it's also in agreement with, I think I mentioned this before, Title IX, the Title IX regulations that were written under the Biden administration also says that on page 1270, if anyone's interested, also agrees with that. But again, it's a big thing for the people that are directly affected. I agree with that. And I think they should get at least a sympathetic ear. But overall, it's not a big issue.
Yeah, well, where I guess like where some of it right gives fuel to the fire, if you want to call it that, is in California to a degree. If you're getting was a gender affirming medicine or care, I forget what, or if they want to change you don't have to tell the parents.
Yeah,
And I'm like, and that's where I'm going. I'm like, they have that, but if that kid went and picked up a gun and shot someone, the parents would be responsible. So if the parents are responsible, if that child wants to do anything, the parent needs to be in the loop.
Yeah.
And that's where, in California is generally, when it comes to things on this issue, are generally on like the way extreme side a lot of times.
Yeah.
Like they take everything to the, kind of like Texas is quote unquote known to take everything far to the right.
Yeah.
California takes everything far to the left. They're kind of like the experiments for both parties, if you want to call it that. And I guess where like when Gavin Newsom kind of came out and seemed like he was going a little bit more center on it. He was like, okay, and then the very next day he's like, just kidding.
Yeah.
And I was like, this guy's full of it, just like when they were like, well, they tried to act like they had no idea LA wasn't going to have enough water for a fire. Oh, well, we didn't know when, Trump and some other even Democrats in California were going, yeah, you did. We were telling you weren't going to have enough water for a while. The federal government was telling you this. Your own state government was telling you this. And you just chose to do nothing about it. The city nor the governor, they all just kind of sat on their hands. And it was for one or two species of fish that they probably could have saved regardless, and I don't know. I'm sure you can slice that cheesecake and go, well, it was justified, not justified. But, in any situation where there's going to be a metropolis, certain things in nature are going to be affected. Certain things are going to get moved, right? So could they have relocated those fish to a different type of situation? I don't know. But I know at some point you got to go, is this two little species fish that's unique to right here?
Mm-hmm.
Is that worth killing or, not killing, but putting all these people in this situation, right? So, and I feel like rather than coming to a middle spot going, okay, well, we don't want to eliminate these fish, from existence. So let's do X, Y, and Z. We've relocated animals before and they flourish. The gray wolf in Michigan, case in point.
Yeah, I think that we run the risk of oversimplifying it, because then to do that type of a program, then you would need to, I'm just thinking out loud here, but you would need to have cooperation from the public as well as a bag of money to do this, because you have to study these fish to make sure that you can relocate them and let them stay there for a couple of seasons to make sure that they're that they're thriving and so on. That takes time and it takes money. And the budgets for these states are usually cut down to the bone to begin with. So it would be really hard. What that would mean is that the governor would have to go to the state legislature and say, please give us money for this. The state legislature might say, well, we'd like to give money to something else. We have some other priorities here. So it's, like I say, we can talk about it, but I think we run the risk of oversimplifying it. It may be simpler. I don't know, but I'm thinking out loud here that it isn't quite so simple as the governor saying, well, we'll worry about this later. I think he has given it more than just casual thought.
I guess, I think it just, the appearance of is that they were sitting on their hands. I mean, especially the LA mayor. She went on a trip to Africa and she knew when she was on her way there that it was happening. And it's like, and you still went?
Yeah.
Like, oh, like, lady, please say you don't care without saying you don't care. I mean, do I truly feel in her heart she don't care? No, I don't think anybody in their right mind wouldn't care, right? But maybe the best way is saying, please say you're detached without saying that you're detached. That means you're not in tune with what's going on in your own community.
Well, that's the Ted Cruz. He went down to, where was this? He went down to Mexico that one time. I forgot what the name of it.
My God, I know. Ted Cruz, he's like one of the biggest jokes of a senator there is.
But I mean, it's that sort of mentality. And I think a lot of politicians, fortunately, take that perspective on things when their constituents really need them. They're like, well, I'm just going to go take my vacation right now. And I think, if you are a leader of any sort, you may have to cancel your vacation. Just like normal people have to cancel their vacation if something blows up at work. We're all subject to that. So
there we go. Yeah, I mean, it's just kind of like when it boils down to it, folks like Ted Cruz, they're just, I don't want to say a stain on America, because that's definitely not the right word I'm trying to use.
Well, he's left over from the old days of the Tea Party. He's left over from that.
Yeah.
And he's still trying to remain relevant.
But he doesn't represent MAGA, and he definitely doesn't represent traditional Republicans.
Yeah.
He's literally a man in a party that he's only there allowed to play in the same sandbox because he was already there.
Yeah.
When they arrived, I mean, because he doesn't really fit in.
Yeah.
And I mean, Tucker Carlson politely told them as much. Like, how are you a senator advocating regime change? You don't even know what's going on.
You should have pulled out a map and said, okay, now point at Iran on this map right here.
Yeah.
And when people talk to me about Iran and stuff, I say, okay, what countries border Iran? Where is Iran? Is it in Central America or is it in the Mideast? Where is it? People, yeah, you're right. I think Tucker Carlson was absolutely right to challenge Ted Cruz in such a way. And I'd have to
It
say,
got
I don't
heated.
agree with Tucker Carlson at all. But then again, the clock
No,
is right twice a day, too.
yeah, I mean, it was. I would have thought that maybe it was lip service, but you could definitely tell how uncomfortable Ted Cruz got real quick. And Tucker Carlson, he just got his face got dialed in.
Yeah.
He'd locked eyes, and his eyes would not move.
Yeah.
Like he was just looking at like Ted Cruz, like, are you being serious with me right now? Like you're not even going to try to politically talk your way out of this? Like,
Well, he backed him into a corner, man. There was no way out of that corner. He put him right in the corner.
I mean, it was just, it was a very, it was good to see somebody within someone's own same circle, right? Say, hey, you're wrong on this. I'm not afraid to say you're wrong on this. And he even said at the end of it, he goes, I don't hate you, but you're wrong. And he goes, you're dead wrong, you know? And I'm like, we gotta be able to have two people of the same party. Be able to, essentially, I mean, there'd have been a fist thrown in that interview.
Yeah.
It wouldn't have surprised me because it got tense.
Well, this actually leads to another topic here, related topic, is that I don't think that a lot of the Republicans, and I know that the order came down for the Republican Party, is to not engage in things like town halls. And you're seeing the result of this, because I think if you go to a town hall and you let people ask the questions they're going to ask, you're going to learn very quickly what's on people's minds and whether or not you're doing the right thing. And I admire anybody that does go to town halls, but I think it's absolutely essential. So if Ted Cruz had been going to town halls and listening from some of his constituents, even the ones that disagree with him, he would have been prepared to answer that question. And he might have even changed his mind about the whole topic, but he wasn't prepared to answer that question precisely because it had never been asked of him before, and he never thought of it before because he's talking in an echo chamber all day long. Everybody says, "Yeah, let's attack Iraq. Let's attack Iraq. Yeah, yeah, let's keep doing it." And nobody even, I'm not Iraq, Iran. I mean, yeah, and nobody's arguing with him. So this is what you get. This is what you get.
Yeah, no, we could go on all night about that. You know, gosh, Ted Cruz and Tucker Carlson, man, that's one that should be on a lot of memes down the road. You know? Two best friends fighting.
One's winning by a lot.
Yeah, I mean, if he could have just took a baseball bat to the knees, that's pretty much what he did to him, right? If Ted Cruz runs for re-election after this, I will be very surprised because whoever runs against him in the primaries or on the opposite side of the aisle, they're going to use that interview against him. I mean, he signed his own political death warrant by not knowing what was going on.
I wouldn't count him out yet. I mean, the guy, he's a slime ball, but he's a smart slime ball. He knows what he's doing, and he knows how to speak in a way that resonates with the people of Texas. So we'll see. We'll see. I never count people like this down because you can make the biggest mistakes in politics these days, and then like a couple of news cycles goes by and people forget about it. It's no big deal anymore.
Oh yeah, for sure.
I mean, look what happened at January 6th. I know you may have some contentions about that, but people pretty much forgot about it. And, and it was
Yeah,
a significant thing.
that's a whole.
So, yeah, I don't want to open up that can of worms right there.
Yeah, I fault the president, and I don't fault the president at the same time, depending on the time of the situation you want to point to.
Yeah.
You know, there's just things that have come out to where I really truly feel, without getting too down into it, is there's an agenda definitely there on both sides, and they both tried to take advantage of it because it was pretty apparent the day before what might happen. It wasn't a secret, and nobody wanted to do anything really to prevent it.
But what do you mean by that, though? I mean, we're going to get into it now, I guess.
Well, there was, just before we sign off, they had the whole Capitol Police thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where Pelosi's page said no, but Trump was like, "Hey, da da da." Do I think it was like a grand conspiracy? No, not really. I know like a lot of people think it does, but it was just they were saying there was whispers there, from the Secret Service, from the FBI, that hey, this may get out of hand.
Right.
We need protection here, and the president technically did do his job in offering the protection, be like, hey, we should protect the Capitol and make sure nothing happens. And then I watched, I believe it was when it was in the Senate, and how the hearing had went to try to convict Trump and all that stuff, and going on that, and how they were like, where it was like fight, 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 or let's go take our capital back, and then it stops, right?
Mm-hmm.
But then this guy shows the whole clip of it, where he's like, and people who don't vote the way we want them to, we're going to take them out in the primaries, and it's like, well, man, for me, that changes the whole context of the situation. It doesn't mean what happened was right. And I truly believe that the president should have came out right away and been like, hey, whoa, this is not what anybody wanted. Do I think at first I think he was waiting to see what would happen and when it started and where it would go. Do I think that he thought that that's what was going to happen from the get-go? No. But I think it's what was happening. I think he was completely okay with going, oh, let's see what happens here.
Well,
But then when he figured out it wasn't going to go that way, he was like, hey, we got to stop this.
That was his final move in a very long series of moves to basically redo that election. That's the way I look at it. And that was his final, most desperate move at that point. Since then, Trump has never, ever conceded that election, even though the evidence is overwhelming. So that
he actually did to one person.
He did what?
He did admit it to one person.
To one person? Who was that?
Bill Maher.
Well,
he told Bill Maher, he goes, yeah, I probably lost.
Well, that's hearsay. I'll take that as hearsay. But yeah, I do remember seeing that interview. Man.
Yeah.
But that was another in a long series of intentional acts on his part, and it was the last desperate act to get people to do this. Now, did he understand that people are going to break in to the Capitol building and do all kinds of things and
that was
spread fecal matter on the wall and things like that? I mean, I don't know. We can't know his mind. But what I do know is that if you wind up a toy and put it on the floor, it's going to walk across the floor, right? And that's what he did. He wound up that thing and wound up the crowd, got him going, and said, "Go get him." It's like a dog. You say, "Go sick him," and the dog's going to do it, right?
When I watched more of that speech and some of the points that they were trying to use against him, when you watch the full context of what he was saying, he wasn't trying to encourage people to go hurt anybody or break in. He was trying to essentially sit there and say, hey, in the galley where you're allowed to go there, voice your opinion, tell your senators or whoever that you're opposed to them certifying this and take your country back. And then if they don't vote the way we want, he even said it, I think, let's go after them in the primaries, and he was like, that's where we're going to take it to them. And then, so I'm sitting there going like, okay, obviously he could have done more to prevent it, and then or once it started happening, go, hey guys, let's put the brakes on this.
Well, that's why I say if this was something that he did not want to have happen, then why did it take him 3 hours to shut it down? Yeah, so no, I think that's exactly what he wanted to have happen. I think he wanted them to go further. Again, I don't know his mind, but just judging from all the incidents that occurred up to that point, the fake elector scheme, the pushing back on Raffensperger in Georgia. I mean, all these things line up, and leaning on Mike Pence at the very end there as well. Oh, yeah. All these stars line up, so it's hard for me to believe that final moment when that final piece was to fall into place, that somehow or another, no, that piece was not intentional. No, I think it was intentional, and I think it was it was violent, and it was meant to be that way.
I don't. Do you ever follow Stephen A. Smith? He was a big sports guy for a long time, commentator, and now he's kind of really dabbling into politics since the election time. And and this is actually, I had heard it from him on one of his little videos, and then I looked into it. I guess the fact that the FBI had 3 or 4 on the payroll, essentially informants in the crowd, and then they had 15, 20 people linked to those informants in the crowd. That definitely do I think the FBI was behind anything? No, not really. But I'm also kind of going, well, if you're with the FBI, how come they're not doing anything about it? If they're going to this degree to infiltrate this crowd, it just kind of makes me go,
well, yeah, it's one thing to have
I don't think the FBI fueled it or anything. I just feel like, if you're that, I feel like they had a duty to do more than they did.
Well, it's one thing to have an informant, but there's a lot of information. And I'm not an agent. I'm not an FBI agent.
Yeah, me neither. I'm just, speculation.
Yeah. So I'm going to speculate then too, that if you have an informant, there has to be a correlation of stories from multiple informants correlating on the same thing. And things were moving pretty fast then. A lot of the people came into town the night before. Yeah, I have no doubt they have informants to this day. They probably have informants in the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers and so on. But these are not enforcers. They're just informants. And they inform whenever they can break free. I would imagine if I were an informant, I wouldn't just like pull up my cell phone and make a phone call right in front of somebody else, right? I got to find some excuse to get out and make it believable. So they may not be able to provide that information in time. So again, things aren't so cut and dry, and we don't, neither you or I are agents.
Yeah,
So I'm speaking a little bit beyond my pay grade here, but I'm just kind of presenting a different way of looking at things.
Well, Dan, it was great having you on today.
Well, thanks, Joe. Appreciate it.
Definitely. I mean, it's a great conversation. Like I said, some of my biggest downloads yet are still in the conversations we have because, like some people told me, like, you're actually able to discuss something with someone without it turning toxic,
Yeah.
nasty, mean, like derogatory.
Yeah.
And I've got some friends who I'm friends with that, I just learned that are, if you want to call it, Trump supporters, where I disagree with Trump on certain things, and they'll be like, oh, well, you're just a liberal. And I'm like, and I go, I'm allowed to disagree with a politician that I per se, maybe, I don't know if you want to call it like or whatever. It doesn't make me one thing or another.
Right.
Nobody's perfect. People like that, and they're my friends, but folks like that just think that way, to me, are like why I started doing this.
Yeah. It's
because it's like there's a market out there. There's a group of people in this country, a lot more than I think people think, that value discourse, debate.
Yeah. No, I think you're absolutely right. And I'll give you a little example. I went through this last night. I was at a festival here, and we had like a little Democratic booth set up, and we had this one kid wander into the booth. I was talking to one potential constituent, and this other kid behind me walks into the booth, and suddenly I get this tap on my shoulder, and it was someone else, another Democrat in the booth, saying, "Hey, you need to talk to this kid." So I broke off my conversation with one guy. I walked back there, and here's this kid, and he's being talked to by two of the Democratic people in the booth, and this kid could hardly get a word in edgewise. And so finally, I just interrupted them and turned to him, locked eyes with him, and said, "How old are you?" He says, 17. I said, "Oh, great. What are you studying?" He says, "Oh, I'm studying to be a carpenter." And he went on about what he was talking about, and he finally got his word out, and I let him talk, right? Because that's the way you learn. That's the way you have a conversation. So after he left the booth, I turned to the other two people and I said, stop talking in so many words, but you can't listen with your mouth open, right? Ask them what they want. Ask them what they're after, and then you'll see it. They'll pause and let you enter to give them some feedback, and that's what the kid did. It was a great kid. He's actually wearing a Trump T-shirt also, which was I found to be very interesting. Is he says, "Hey, I'm just interested in what you guys are doing. I want to get the full story from everybody." I felt like hugging him because they're like, "Man, as young as you are, you've got the right attitude. I don't care if you got the Trump shirt on or not. Get out there and find out what the story is and get to the truth. Talk to the people, but don't let people talk at you like they were doing. Just talk with people."
Yeah. We need, I've got a niece that's the same way too. My 15-year-old's the same way.
Really?
Full disclosure, my 15-year-old he's not what you would call woke, but he's definitely a little bit more open to that, and that has taught me a lot of things that I probably would not have known before, right? But I've told him, I said, hey, as long as you're not coming home calling anybody any bad names, because do what you do.
Yeah.
I'm like, it's odd because he still preferred Trump over Kamala Harris, which I would have not expected.
Wow. Yeah.
He just said, his exact words were, "At least I know what the guy's saying he's going to try to do." And he just said he felt like...
Interesting.
And he didn't trust what she had to say. I mean, and I was like, now, mind you, he was a lot younger, 10 years old back then, but he goes, "I like Biden because he seems really nice." And I'm like,
yeah.
I mean, it's because he didn't know where he was.
Yeah. When you're that young, I think it's hard to figure out, how to make good judgments on people. And I think some people never get it their whole lives. they'll say, "Oh, I like him because I like the way he looks." Like, okay, Gavin Newsom, yeah, he's a pretty handsome guy, but that's no reason to vote for him, right? You
Yeah,
got to,
I think he just got good. I wouldn't say good vibes, but he just got like,
yeah,
well, at least I know what I'm getting.
yeah. I'd say you really don't. I think is it your son you said that was so he's right to not just outright trust politicians. And yeah, I get what he's saying about Kamala Harris, but on the other hand, Trump is a notorious for telling a lot of fibs. So his are so blatant that maybe people just don't take him seriously. But
No, they. I know a lot of people that voted for him. People are like, oh, he said this and this. They're just like, yeah, the guy's stuck out his butt. But they'll say that people that vote for him. I know they know that some of what he says is just hyperbole.
yeah,
But a lot of them look at some of the actions that he's taken and they agree with him, and that's why they tend to go that way. But I do know, I don't know about a good chunk, but a lot of people that I know, they do know that some of the things he says that he's just kind of spouting off, and it just kind of probably isn't real, but is what that is there. But thanks, Dan. I appreciate it. And I look forward to having you on again soon. I mean, like I said, it is great, and
I love
people love it.
I love the conversation, and it's good to talk and exchange ideas. And like I said, I think we agree a lot in a lot of areas, and I think
Oh yeah,
we should continue these conversations.
yeah, and I'm sure Trump will give us enough to talk about in a couple weeks.
Without a
No shortage.
shortage.
Okay, Dan.
Okay, great. Thanks,
You have a
Joe.
good one.
You too. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye bye.
Bye bye.